Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this webinar presentation of the Iowa Environmental Council's Electric Generation Condition of the State Report for 2024. My name is Marshall James. I'm the Communications Advocate Associate for the Energy Team here at Iowa Environmental Council, and I'm joined with our Distinguished Energy Counsel, Steve Geyer, and our Energy Program Director, Kerri Johanssen. And we're excited to present to you this, which is part of our annual report on the current landscape of energy generation in the state and some of the challenges and opportunities that are present when it comes to powering our homes, businesses, farms, and municipalities. Steve will be our primary presenter, and Kerri will be in the background monitoring for questions. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. Post them to the chat, and once we get to the end of the presentation, there'll be time to go over some Q&A. So who is the Iowa Environmental Council? Hopefully you already know who we are because you're tuning in, but if you're new, we are the largest coalition of environmentally concerned organizations, municipalities, and businesses in the state, working primarily on clean water, boostering for clean energy throughout the state, and addressing both the climate crisis and soil health and public health here in the state. We work on every level of government, advocating for policies based in science. We're working towards a just, healthy environment that is sustainable for all Iowans. And we represent over 100 organizations across the state. So our presenter today, Steve Geyer, he's our Energy Policy Counsel, and just a font of information, especially when it comes to the energy sector here in Iowa, having been a professional in Iowa's energy sector for, as far as I know, most of his entire adult life. So if there's something to be known about energy in the state, Steve knows it. And so it's been a real treat working with him over this past year with all the information that he has to share. And so we're really excited to have him here to lead this. He's the primary author on our Condition of the State reports each year. And so there's no better person to present on it. So I guess I'll hand it off to you, Steve. Thank you, Steve.
Sure. Thanks, Marshall. So thank you very much for the intro. And I am Steve Geyer of the Energy Policy Council at the Environmental Council. So let's start the presentation. And I'm going to start with the climate change impacts. And this whole presentation will be about our generation within the state, but importantly, the fact that our generation, certainly as fossil fuels are known, to have impacts in terms of climate change, and that these impacts are costing Iowa businesses, the families, the governments, and the taxpayers billions of dollars per year. And we'll show that towards the end, and we'll show solutions to move past that. So we should know by now. If you don't, we do have targets for those, basically trying to address climate change. Consistent with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we do have not only goals within the US, and so those goals can be succinctly summarized as we need to eliminate fossil fuel generation by 2035, and we actually need to eliminate coal generation by 2030. If we do that and recognize these are international goals, not just the US, we should be able to attain or at least maintain warming no greater than 1.5 degrees C, or the worst case is looking at 2 degrees C. But again, we need to understand also that generation within basically this overall view of climate change is essential to allowing many of these other sectors to actually achieve net zero by 2050, which is the ultimate goal. So where does Iowa fit into this? So if we look at Iowa's contribution to climate change, and these are the facts and basically a report that the state actually documents every year. They've done it since 2005. And so if we look at the 2022, and by the way, they're always 1 year behind as far as reporting these. So if we look at the power plant emissions, it shows that they were 17% of overall greenhouse gas emissions in Iowa in 2022. To put a number behind that, overall greenhouse gas emissions were 124 million metric tons total. And so we can do the math real quick, but that's 21 million metric tons roughly that the power plants actually represented. Interestingly enough, we'll also notice that ag and the residential, or just call it the building sector, Both are larger than power plants, but again, recognizing that these are all interrelated and one depends on the other. Importantly, the power plants have to occur first in order, again, for the others to allow them to achieve that zero goal. We can take a look at that in a slightly different way, where they also have, the state has basically tracked the progress over time. Importantly here, notice that power plant emissions have come down quite a bit since 2005. But again, back to this interrelated process, we'll notice also that the ag sector and the building sector haven't really changed that much. And without basically a renewable sector or at least a zero carbon sector, those really cannot achieve that. So let's focus on the generation, since that's something that we know we have to focus on. If we take a look at this from basically the year 2000 through 2023, a couple things of note. Clearly, back in 2000, we were primarily almost all coal generation. And then we started generating wind roughly in the 2007, 2008 timeframe, and that's been increasing steadily. In 2019 was actually the crossover point where we started generating more wind in the state than we actually generated coal. Also of note, you'll see the swing on the tail end here, the 2022, 2023 timeframe, where we're starting to see solar now finally pick up as a part of it. But we'll also notice that gas generation is still actually not only a part of, but an increasing part of our overall generation. So there's a lot of reasons this may be happening, but if we ask the sort of the constant question, oh, well, why is this happening? Um, the real driver here is the cost of generation. And so this is a levelized cost generation. This analysis occurs every year, put out by Lazards, and it's going to show us that since that time frame a few years back, where wind and solar both started to represent the cheapest forms of generation, beating out every other source, and most importantly, beating out the fossil resources. Even the lowest cost fossil resource is higher than either wind or solar, as we can see by this chart. And the important thing, obviously, also here is recognizing that this is a levelized cost that does not actually reflect any subsidized costs. So this is not a cost that's reflective of the current tax credits that are available to renewables. It is still the lowest cost form of generation, regardless. Although we will see that, and we believe that with the Inflation Reduction Act, we will see a tremendous increase in renewable generation. Even an unsubsidized version is going to see that, but with subsidies, we should see that actually increase. In fact, some projections show that we'll have double the amount of wind and solar by 2030. And that's nationally, not just Iowa. So what does the Iowa resource mix look like? So I'll focus right now on Alliant and Mid-American because the coal plants that operate in the state are operated by Mid-American and Alliant. So overall, and they serve, by the way, the majority of Iowa as far as population. Mid-American in 2023 has 60% of their generation representative wind, and Alliant is increasing. They're up to 32% by 2023. You'll notice, however, that fossil resources still represent a substantial portion, with 30% represented within American and 68% represented within the Alliant mix. Although, and we'll notice this in the next, well, a couple charts away here, where as we look at the overall progress of these, we'll clearly see that the fossil resources, at least the coal resources, are being operated less and less. And I mentioned we talked about Mid-American and Alliant as the operators, but I think it's important for us to realize that these plants are not just owned by Mid-American and Alliant. They are what's considered to be joint-owned plants. And so here's a slide that shows the ownership of each of the 6 units. And you'll notice that the cooperatives and many of the municipal utilities all have ownership interest in many of these plants. The other thing I'll note as we look at this chart is there are none of the plants, with the exception of Walter Scott 4, is close to what we would consider to be anything new. In fact, these are all relatively old plants. And even Walter Scott 4 now is already approaching, soon will be approaching 20 years of operation. But importantly, also, I want to notice the percentages that the municipals and the cooperatives actually have. These are not large percentages, and certainly as we wrap up the end of the presentation, there's certainly an opportunity here for all of these low minority interest to find their way out of these resources and to lower cost resources represented as renewables. But if we flip back again then to Alliant and Mid-American, since they are the operating entities, they report how much basically they generate each year by resource type. And so we'll see that in 2023, again, I mean, a lot of our generation is now coming from wind, especially on the Mid-American side, where we had almost 29 million megawatt hours of wind when the two are combined, but that still has about 12 million megawatts of coal that actually is being generated. And then here's the slide I was referring to, where if we take a look at the actual plants, and I recognize there's a lot of information on this page, but if we track each of the plants from 2017 through 23, there's some trends that we should be able to sort of see within these bar charts. The one trend, and by the way, if we take a look at for instance, the Alliant facilities, the coal plants are on your left-hand side, and then you'll see Emory, and the ones to the right are actually the gas plants. On the Mid-American side, Greater Des Moines is the only gas plant, and then all the others are coal. So if we look at the coal plants, even though they vary year to year, overall the trend is going down as far as the amount of coal generation that actually is utilized every year for obvious reasons. If the wind, which I've already shown is a cheaper resource, then ultimately that should start displacing the coal units. And in fact, we should see the coal units operating less and less over time. The gas plant's a little bit different in terms of the current trend. Natural gas currently is relatively cheap, and so we obviously are seeing then that trend pan out as far as gas plant operations, where in fact those are actually increasing in their production. But again, back to our levelized cost, even there, if the wind is available, it will displace that gas plant or the coal plant. So let's talk about the impacts of the coal generation in Iowa. And so, in addition to clearly the cost that we pay embedded within the utility, there are externalities associated certainly with coal generation. We can model this. We can certainly quantify this in terms of monetary impact to us. And so one of those models that's available to basically look at what is the actual cost to individuals is called the EPA co-benefit or the COBRA tool. And so it's actually assessing what are the impacts of the pollutants that come out of the coal plants. And so we look at the pollutants, and the primary ones in terms of air emissions, you have the sulfur dioxide, the nitrogen oxides, mercury, and carbon dioxide, which is clearly a climate driver. But mercury itself is a pollutant that resonates, I'll just say, even in Iowa, where we have fish advisories on some of the lakes due to the mercury, and that mercury is clearly from these coal plants. But if we put a monetary value on it, the COBRA model will tell us that, in fact, in 2023, that was amounting to anywhere from $270 million to $400 million for the year. And then another study, and this one was just this last year, found that PM 2.5 from these coal plants actually is associated and can be linked to 460,000 early deaths in the US between 1999 and 2020. And they actually quantified that per plant. And so between those same years, it showed that 340 Iowans and 5,460 premature deaths overall, meaning the surrounding states, can be attributed during that time frame, roughly 20 years, of the coal plant operation. So if we take that one step further, and so I put the little slide together here to show what that really means. So we can extrapolate that to basically figure out then, well, how many deaths based on that assumption could we associate with each of these plants? And so the number you see there in terms of the that deaths from each plant is actually looking at, well, what if we took that all the way back to, I also put in the start date there for each of those plants. Now the study itself actually, so let's take a look at NEAL 3. The study itself basically showed that 790 deaths were associated with that plant for that 20-year time frame. But when we look all the way back then to 1975, that's really looking at probably a minimum of 778. And the reason I say a minimum is that the 20 years also reflected the fact that during that same time frame, pollution controls came into place and started reducing the number of emissions. Whereas if you look all the way back to when these plants started, pollution controls really were not in place. Literally, the only thing that was on the plant were uh, precipitators to try and control the amount of particulates and the amount of ash that came out of the plant. So again, if we take a look at all of that, this is something relatively new, but I think it's important to understand that overall, the more time that goes on, the more we discover that these plants really are having major impacts on the health of Iowans and the finances of Iowans. By the way, the PM 2.5, it should be understood, PM 2.5 itself is not a pollutant, it's a measure of pollutant. And so that's what they've discovered with this study was that not all PM 2.5 is equal. The PM 2.5 pollution coming out of a coal plant is literally a combination of all these metals that are associated within the coal, whether it's mercury, whether it's arsenic, whether it's other heavy metals, all combined within that particular PM 2.5 particle, which is different than other PM 2.5 particles, which may have an entirely different chemical composition. Another way we can look at then costs associated with the plants is the social cost of carbon. And so the social cost of carbon is a look where we take, and this is a US based an EPA based number. And so they look at basically both a amount for the CO2 and an amount for the nitrous oxides. And so that multiplier there, that's the dollars, then that's basically per metric ton. Well, if we look at then the metric tons that were basically emitted from the plants in 2023, so it was 15.54 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, 9.9 thousand metric tons of nitrous oxide. But that equates then using those values to 2.3 billion to 6.2 billion dollars. And yet another study showed that in fact we're having an impact in terms of Iowa's corn yield, resulting from basically the plants themselves. This was a University of California study, and their study also looked over 10 years. And what they actually did was they looked at, well, what happened to corn yields over a 10-year period after coal plants actually closed? And so what they discovered was that the closure of those plants actually represented then an increase in corn yield over that period of time. And so they then extrapolated that to say, well, what does that mean in terms of the remaining generation that we have? And so then that extrapolation says, well, that means that we have a foregone opportunity at place here. And same thing, we can place a value on that. So anywhere from the 66 million tons, or excuse me, basically the bushels, to the 330 million bushels. And obviously we don't have that corn price right now, but at the time in 2023, the price was $6.01 per bushel at that time frame. And so that was a 396 million to 1.9 billion cost associated with lost corn production. So what is the true cost of coal? And we'll take a look at that by looking then at the three major areas I just went through in terms of the health cost, which was basically the COBRA, the corn loss, which was based on the University of California study, and then the social cost, which is an EPA value. And we sum that up and then divide it by the kilowatt hours that were produced basically of coal in the state during 2023. And that actually represents what can be viewed as cost to society, externalities that we all face of 70 cents to 24 cents per kilowatt hour for, again, basically these coal generating plants. What does that mean in terms of how that is viewed and how that is actually reported? Well, the utilities do have to report their cost of each of the plants to FERC every year. And so when they report those are operational costs. And so the little blue, excuse me, not blue, the green basically represents what's reported on FERC Form 1. And so I know the graph is how to say hard to see what that is, but that ranges right in the 2.5 cents basically to roughly 3 cents per kilowatt, basic kilowatt hour basically from these plants. And so if we then add on our true minimum and our true maximum, you can see that we're really, as customers, basically of these plants, paying anywhere from almost 30 cents per kilowatt hour to clearly over 70 cents per kilowatt hour from any generation that actually comes from these plants. So let's start the talk in terms of, again, a transition away from the coal, away from the fossil units to 100% renewable. This is a graph showing again just Mid-American and Alliant in terms of what they generated as far as selling to customers, but more importantly then selling to utilities. And so the green represents what they basically are selling to utilities. You'll notice that certainly sales to customers and utilities from Mid-American is actually increasing. And obviously, you can read that just as well as I can, Dan. Basically, the utility sales basically increased by 87%, while the customer sales increased by 36% over that time frame for Mid-American. Alliance slightly different. They're seeing an increase in utility sales by 25%, but in fact, their customer sales actually decreased by 4% over that timeline. Now, why is this important? Certainly, we've seen some of Mid-Americans advertising, touting that they're 100% renewable. What is not recognized is that that's not, it's how you account for it. So they actually generate enough renewable to represent as an offset to their customer sales, but that doesn't mean they're actually represented or generating only renewable energy. And I think that's sort of the important point that we want to make. Because if we want to have a path to 100% renewable, we're a long ways there. I mean, we're already at 64% in terms of Iowa's generation in 2023. That's more than any other state. And it should give us an advantage where we really don't have as much of a hurdle to overcome to achieve that 100% goal. Now, we clearly are already uniquely positioned, but if we aggressively take advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act, there are a lot of incentives and a lot of mechanisms. And by the way, these will last all the way through 2032 that can get us there. That's going to include not only basically the ITC and the PTC, which is investment tax credit and production tax credit, with labor requirements and prevailing wage. Now, I'll explain that a little bit later, but that depends on the size of your system. And when we're talking about utility systems, they're largely going to be over 1 megawatt, and that's the threshold. Anything over 1 megawatt means that to get those levels of basically the ITC or PTC, you'll have to meet the labor requirements, which is a combination of prevailing wage and then also apprenticeship requirements. But these are substantial. And in addition, the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, brings along with it a bonus if you're in an energy community. They also have a bonus, basically, if you're meeting domestic content. Both of those bonuses are 10%. And the great thing about the Inflation Reduction Act, all of these actually are stackable. And so you can end up easily with a facility that, if it's an energy community, has a 50% tax credit of basically investment tax credit, 50%. So let's look at these bonuses a little bit, because this is important also. So the energy community is any place where a coal facility in Iowa, anyway, and a coal facility closed since 2009. And so it's that census tract and it's any adjoining census tract around that census tract. So this is a map showing that. And so the darker color, gold, yellow, whatever you want to call it, is actually the census tract where the plant retired. And then the lighter shade is then all the adjoining census tract. So each of these locations, and obviously these correspond to some of those that we saw on the map earlier. For instance, this corresponds to the Neal plants in Sioux City. You have one around the Walter Scott plants in Council Bluffs. Similarly, you have the Muscatine area, you have the Dubuque area, the Lansing area, and then some smaller areas around Marshalltown, Pella, and one up in Fort Dodge. But again, anything renewable facility that's built within these particular areas qualifies then for that additional 10%. And similarly, if it's a PTC, production tax credit, it also has then an added 10% value onto that. What are these incentives that we're looking at? So just a brief slide that sort of shows, this is not all of it, but a certain portion of it. So again, if we had a facility that was looking at, above a megawatt, then we would basically have to make sure we meet the labor requirements. But if it's below that megawatt, then we can easily stack 50% if we're looking at a wind facility or a battery facility, for instance, that could achieve a 50% tax credit. On the PTCs, similarly, they start with a base and then they're additive, so that if you are again meeting labor requirements, you're going to get the full value for that tax credit. So one of the biggest, if not the biggest advantage, however, with the Inflation Reduction Act is that all of these tax credits now are available and can be utilized by any tax exempt organization. So our rural electric cooperatives, our municipals can all receive a direct payment for the value of that tax credit. And even Alliant or Mid-American, if suppose they don't have sufficient tax liability, they can actually, it's called a transfer, but technically it's selling that tax credit to someone who can actually utilize it. It'll be a discounted value, but still that provides a way to lower the cost of that project, because they can either transfer it, or if you're tax exempt, you can have that as a direct payment from the Treasury back to your entity. And even though we're talking about utilities overall in this presentation, clearly we have that same opportunity for any business entity to take advantage of these ITCs or PTCs. And there's even a personal one available through another section of the code, which is also 30%. The personal systems can't avail themselves of those bonuses, but any business system certainly can. And if we take a look at the fact that batteries are included in that, we have the opportunity within the next roughly, basically a little over 10 years now, to actually achieve a lot. And the more that's done on the business side, the less that we have to do on the utility side. So it's really a win-win situation, but it's a timed situation where even though we have until 2032 on the tax credits, and that's also got a caveat to it. If we achieve 75% reductions by basically from 2022, then basically it ends at 2032. If we don't achieve that, then actually the tax credits continue, or at least that's the way the code is currently structured. And then one other major, I'll just say, program that's available through Inflation Reduction Act is the Energy Infrastructure Reinvestment Program. This clearly has huge potential benefit. And in fact, this allows for, think of it like refinancing. So if I have outstanding remaining balance or debt on my coal plant, if I incorporate that with then actually putting in additional renewable generation, I could actually put that all under one, basically low cost loan, just slightly above the Treasury bond, basically yield Treasury bond. And in fact, that's been analyzed by Rocky Mountain Institute for, in fact, the Lansing facility. They actually analyzed utilizing that program where they would refinance the remaining plant balance at Lansing, which, by the way, has been raised and is no longer there, but still, of course, has that remaining plant balance that has to be currently paid off by ratepayers. But our RMI basically did the study and says, well, if you went with the EIR program, you could refinance the remaining balance, and you could then fund basically part of your planned renewable generation adoption. And by doing so, you would actually end up saving your ratepayers 124 million in net present value terms. Now, the largest, I'll just say, concern here is this is clearly one where complacency needs to be eliminated, and basically urgency needs to occur because we have a deadline. And so the application deadline is September of 26 for this program. Now, the disbursement deadline is 2031. But if you want to basically have any chance of doing this, you need to get your application in before September 2026 in order for you to be able to take advantage of this program. So I'm going to wrap this up by making some conclusions. I'm going to just actually read these because I think each of them is important enough for you. So what do I want to conclude here? Well, the threats to air quality, groundwater, and surface waters posed by these plants is resulting in health and economic harm, as well as deaths of Iowans and others. That if we have a true and transparent accounting by Mid-American, Alliant, the co-ops, the municipals, we would be considering the full range of costs that are borne by captive customers, which is what we are, of utilizing these coal plants. I was been a leader on clean energy for over 20 years, deploying a lot of wind energy, and as a result, basically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We have a lot of natural wind and solar resources to reach that 100% renewable energy goal. And Iowa utilities, because of where we already have gone, are uniquely positioned to actually achieve this by 2035. And really, we need to take, I'll just say, full attent to this point, which is it won't occur unless the utilities aggressively act to take full advantage of the Inflation Reduction Act incentives that will provide a low-cost transition for ratepayers, and more importantly, pushing out even the message to their ratepayers that they can help the overall system by themselves taking advantage of the IRA. And so with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Steve. And Kerri's been monitoring our Q&A field. So if you haven't had a chance to ask your questions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A. And I'll hand it off to Kerri to field some questions to Steve.
All right. So thank you so much for all the questions that we had in the chat. I think as Steve gets that arranged, I wanted to speak to a couple of the questions that were along the same line. The first question, so if wind and solar are cheaper, it would be expected that entities trying to make money would use them. I'm guessing that Mid-Am and Alliant would say the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, so we have to have a coal gas as backup. How would you respond to that? I don't believe our energy storage battery is efficient enough yet to store that energy to make up for those times. So Steve, I think I'll let you respond to the battery question. I want to talk a little bit about just about the rational actor money question. This is something that, there's a lot of education that, before I started, working in the energy space, I flipped my lights on and I didn't really think about too much about the business models of utilities. And so in Iowa, as Steve has mentioned several times, we have monopoly utilities that go to the utilities board for approval of generation that they want to build or assets that they want to build. And the way that they make money is by investing in capital. And when they make a capital investment, they earn a 9 to 12% rate of return on that investment typically. And then that money is passed directly on to ratepayers into our rates. And that's really true of any expenditure the utility makes ends up getting rolled up into rates for ratepayers. And so they're not operating in a competitive environment where they're trying to find the lowest cost generation because they're trying to compete for your business. You get the utility you get, you pay the rates you pay, and that's why we have a regulator, because we have this monopoly system where we have an economic regulator whose job it is to make sure that utilities are acting in the best interest of customers and keeping rates as low as possible. However, we are missing some regulatory mechanisms in Iowa that mean that that's not really happening here the way that it should. And one of those is called integrated resource planning. I think we'll be having more conversations about that this fall and offering more education about this kind of gap in Iowa's regulations that is really fundamental to solving this economic disincentive problem. And with that, Steve, if you have more to add on the incentives of utilities that conflict with clean energy, and then some of the, is battery storage ready for prime time? We'd love to hear your perspective.
Sure. So I'm going to start sort of at the beginning here, because we need to also recognize that Iowa, and just like every utility in the country, is in transition. And so we're not saying this happens overnight, but and what we're saying is it will happen. It's merely a matter of timing. And so as we look at then the technical aspects of, can it be done? The answer is yes. And in fact, over the past year to 2 years, California and Texas have both demonstrated that storage is actually adding a lot of value to their systems. And in fact, it is displacing and taking the place of, whether it is the coal plants or the gas plants, either one. And the aspects of terms of, why doesn't Iowa have storage? By the way, if you take a look back at that chart I showed you, solar plus storage actually brings in a lower cost than solar alone. And so it is a very viable resource when you actually couple them. As far as the ability to, ask the question, why aren't we doing it? Well, I mean, I'll just say the interesting thing is that at the other Berkshire Hathaway subsidiaries, which, by the way, Mid-American is a Berkshire Hathaway company, they all basically are doing storage. And whether it's Rocky Mountain Power is actually not only doing storage on its utility system, but they're also utilizing and putting batteries in customers' locations and then utilizing that as a virtual power plant. That's one of the mechanisms that, as we're looking towards the future, I think will become more prevalent. We will see more and more of that, where the utility will actually recognize and sort of change the paradigm from a one-direction utility to a two-direction utility, where they fully utilize that. Could we do it today? Yes, we could. Is there a reason that we're not? Sort of. I mean, if I'm operating a utility and I want to make the most amount of money, I mean, the reality is that Iowa is a very viable wind state. And so the more wind I generate, the more basically I get to sell it into the market, at least presently. And that has, right now, it may change, but that has more value to the utility than it does to actually invest that in the storage. So the simple answer is, although it's not simple, yes, we can do it, but it's going to take time.
All right, Steve, another question. Is there a need for Iowans to decrease overall energy consumption in order to fully transition to renewables? I.e., if we keep demanding more and more energy, will those gaps just be filled by increased renewable infrastructure rather than working to take over fossil fuel generation?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's sort of actually is, I'll follow on because that's sort of what I was going with the last one. I think we're going to see a transition again away from our current paradigm, which is the utilities provide everything, to one where the customers themselves actually not only start to have their own generation on site, but they actually start to work as a part of the overall system. Yes, there are projections that we're going to see a rapid increase in overall electric consumption. I'll put it that way, because electric consumption and demand will not necessarily be the exact same thing. Because if a customer is actually generating their own, they aren't increasing the overall demand. They're increasing electric consumption overall. in the state, but it doesn't increase demand. If we take a look at, do we need to decrease? I don't think actually, if we take a look at what's necessary, I start back to the original part of the presentation where electrification is the solution to climate change, at least a mechanism to get us there. And so we will see increased utilization of electricity as we try and basically tackle that huge effort. So should we do it wisely? Should we basically, not use them more than we have to? Yes. Do I think it necessarily means that we have to do that to get more renewables? No. I think it will head that direction regardless.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, and to take on that point a little bit, what you said about doing it wisely, right? Like, we want to build a system that's right for the demand that we have. But yes, like we believe that, and the numbers show and the technology shows that we can get a lot of the way there in the near term. And this is going to be a transition where then we take incremental steps to get the rest of the way there. We had a question here about that forecasted demand for electric power in Iowa, especially related to server farms. So this is a hot topic. Lots of folks are talking about right now. Do you have any thought on this demand growth?
I do. And I view server farm projections as being interrelated to a lot of what we're talking about. When a server farm, or any large entity for that matter, proposes that they're going to locate in a certain area, it's not instant. And so if the utility has the ability to serve that load at that time, yes. But as we're looking at all these, I'll say, confounding factors, where we're looking at a transmission system that is acknowledged as being, I'll put it as, undersized. We already are stretching the bounds of what we currently have. And so, transmission is recognized as one of the things that's going to allow us to fully utilize renewable energy, where we're not having to rely on it just in Iowa, but just like we're shipping renewable energy already out of state, we will be receiving renewable energy in state when other areas, whether the wind blows or the sun shines. That's how the system is envisioned as actually working in the future. But that transmission is a key. And so, we may have these huge projections all around the country where server farms are talking about popping up everywhere. But if the system's not there to meet that demand at the time, it's not going to happen as fast as projections are currently, I'll just say, laying out. They may be able to put in a server farm, and many of them will, because some of them are looking at, again, back to the aspect of providing your own energy. If they basically provide some of their own energy, then yeah, it might actually have ability to increase economic viability in the area. But similarly, if they provide some of their own, it doesn't increase overall demand on the system. So I mean, it'll be a balance. Do I think it's going to occur as fast as some of the projections? Personally, no, because there's too many cogs that basically are in place that have to move all at the same time.
Yes, and just to add to that a little bit, there are also, private companies that are developing server farms. We always think about the ones that are, already owned or being constructed by companies like Microsoft and Google. But there are a lot of folks doing this for the internet, other people to use server farms more generally. And the development process for those types of server farms is a little bit different. And so they might be looking at multiple sites at the same time. And so they get counted multiple times. And there are, a lot of companies out doing that more kind of speculative development. So it's kind of hard to get a handle on exactly what kind of load growth we're looking at. It is coming, but it's not as large as what the projections are sort of being put out there as. In a way, it's being used as kind of a scare tactic in some corners against our ability to transition all the way to 100% renewable energy in the time frame we need to do so for climate change.
Could I add one more point to that, Kerri? Because I don't think people necessarily understand where some of those projections are coming from. But you're right, because the way that those projections occur is when the utilities themselves report basically back to their regional transmission organizations as to what is projected on their system. And so all they can feed that transmission organization is information that they're getting from people like their economic development groups that have like you say, speculation saying, hey, we're looking at such and such. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. I mean, there are economic development groups for every utility. That's what they do. They try and recruit entities in. They keep track of them. A lot of times, basically, they may not pan out. And so that's what leads to this sort of overhyping in terms of overall load that may or may not basically appear.
Yes, thank you. Okay, a question about the EIR. Does the EIR program support hybrid long-duration energy storage systems, such as nickel hydrogen, electric thermal energy storage, pumped hydro, or large-scale water electrolysis for hydrogen, so that these technologies can be used as backup power and or feedstock for converting energy back to the grid when needed?
Yeah, I will say that my reading of it is extremely broad. It literally uses language that says any repowering, I mean, you have to have a facility to begin with. I mean, it's not intended to go out and, in a greenfield type situation. But yeah, if you've got an existing facility somewhere, that any type of reutilization or revitalization, I believe, is viable for these.
All right, great. And then we got a question about um, what are the existing state and federal incentives that are motivating the behavior of Mid-American and Alliant to not sufficiently embrace the clean energy incentives? I am assuming rational behavior by the energy producers once again, which I think goes back to a little bit of what we talked about with monopoly behaviors. But do we know, what would we point to for sort of their existing incentive structures that might be driving their behavior? And then also a question on IEC's position on a carbon tax.
So I'll start with actually, I want to start with the carbon tax first. Carbon taxes are, I almost think of it like an ancient history kind of thing. I mean, they've been speculated since the 70s as far as a mechanism to put in place. Every time they ever come up, I mean, the same thing with any type of tax, it almost automatically gets shot down because it's a tax. I actually believe that the Inflation Reduction Act is in fact demonstrating how, that the proverbial carrot is far more effective than a tax. So I actually don't foresee a carbon tax coming at any point. The second part, why? Well, I mean, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, by the way, they are utilizing it. I mean, if we take a look at Mid-American, I mean, they got approval for what they called Wind Prime, which is 2,000 additional megawatts of wind. They haven't actually completed that yet. They're still working on getting basically that additional generation built online. Even Alliant actually is going down that path. So they are utilizing it. As far as if you're asking the question of utilizing it to replace the fossil generation, yeah, I mean, certainly that is possible. They could do it by investing in batteries. They certainly could do that, starting out at a slower pace and moving, more aggressively toward it. Again, this basically the energy community bonus could be greatly utilized, but that's something that overall currently utilities are making more money on their existing assets.
Does it look likely that Iowa utilities will adopt more dynamic pricing models for residential customers to incentivize users to shift loads that store energy through HVAC, EV charging, et cetera, and high load uses like dry and close, baking, computing to high production times?
I think that's possible. I mean, obviously, some of the cooperatives have already moved that direction. Alliant itself is moving that direction. So, simple answer, yeah, I think so.
Do you think it will take some advocacy and work and education to move people in that direction?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, there's so much potential, right, for these technologies and for more advanced kinds of system controls. In Iowa, it's a little tough. We had a bill passed in 2018 that really limited our energy efficiency and demand response programs to be a small, really, tightly capped expenditure portion by the utilities, and also sort of sent the message that like energy efficiency and demand response are not priorities. And frankly, we've seen the utilities respond in kind by not making them priorities. And so programs like these that have a lot of promise, that really would allow people to be full participants in their own energy, the energy system and their own energy destiny, it are just really haven't really been on the table. It's entirely possible. And certainly at IEC, we will continue to advocate for that and bring in experts who can help utilities create those programs in a way that's meaningful for Iowans. But it is a bit of a struggle with the state law the way it is around energy efficiency still. All right, I think that we are, Marshall is telling me we're about at wrap up time here. And so I so appreciate everyone attending today, and I will pass it back over to Marshall and Steve.
Yeah, before we let everybody go, I want to make sure to highlight that Iowa Environmental Council's annual conference is returning this year. It's happening at the end of this month on the 24th of September on Drake University's campus. And here is a link to register for our conference. We're going to have a lot of great speakers, multiple tracks, also a continuing legal education track for attorneys and people in law who are seeking that out. Our own Steve Geyer will be speaking on one of our panels. I think, Kerri, you may also be on a panel as well. So we have not only experts at IEC, but experts from across the state and region speaking on a variety of topics. Also, if you are a student, we are now offering student tickets for free. So we'd love to see more students, especially more Drake students at this event. So we really want to let folks know about that. And also our annual, one of our annual fundraisers, the Pro H2O event is happening that same week. Here's a link to register for it as well. And an anonymous sponsor has sponsored 50 tickets to Pro H2O. So if you register for it if you're one of the next 50 people to register for it and use the code FREE, you'll get a free ticket. We'll have drinks, hors d'oeuvres, music. It'll be a nice evening of fundraising for our water program and pushing for cleaner, healthier water in the state. And then I guess I'd be remiss if I also didn't point out that we have our, if you would like to read the condition of the state, if you haven't gotten a chance to see it, I will share a link to it as well.
Yes, thanks for your time and attention. Really appreciate it. And yes, look for more opportunities like this one coming up this fall.
All right, and we'll be posting this to our YouTube channel and sharing it out to everyone. So if you found this helpful, please share it with people in your network. Our big goal here at IEC is a wider, broader public education on these issues. An informed public makes smarter decisions. And we believe the data and the facts are on our side. It really pushes towards a cleaner, sustainable, and more affordable Iowa. So thank you for taking time out of your day to spend it with us.